Greetings and welcome to week 1 of Scientific Research Methodology MOOC. In this section of M1.1, Research, a systematic process of inquiry, I would like to first start with the quote of the famous Hungarian biochemist and also the Nobel laureate Albert Szent-Györgyi, who mentioned, "Research is to see what everybody else has seen and to think what nobody else has thought." Of course, research has a very direct connection with academicians pursuing it for their PhD degree, but it should not be considered only for this specific purpose. There is more than one reason why research studies are undertaken. A few broad ones could be mentioned, such as to pursue the inquiry-based learning among the students at different levels of their academic journey. The teachers could use the research-based pedagogy as an innovative way of teaching learning process to relate some situation or certain occurrences in order to establish a concrete theory for these or to get more meaningful insights into these, to check if a given assumption about a certain process or an observation is correct, and to analyze and evaluate a certain phenomenon vis-a-vis its frequency of occurrence, factors controlling it, and also if it is related to some other phenomenon, and so on. Let us discuss the attributes of a good scientific research. I would request you to please pause the video and write down a few characteristics that you think are attributes of a good scientific research. Thank you for your answers. You may have written some of the answers which I would be discussing now. Scientific research should be a purposeful process so that it has its application in the larger interest of all beings. As it is a systematic process of inquiry, it must have clearly defined objectives and the rationale for the investigation. The process of inquiry must be directed towards the collection of the authentic data and its correct interpretation through appropriate statistical analysis. The protocols associated with the research study should be standardized such that the study, when repeated, will produce the results that would be of a consistent trend as obtained earlier. This also confirms the reproducibility of the results as well as the accuracy and the rigor of the scientific research conducted. As far as possible, the inferences drawn from the research study should be such that they could be extrapolated for higher levels of scientific inquiry. For example, in case of animal experimental studies, the model animals should be chosen such that the results obtained could be extrapolated to higher animals or maybe to human beings. Now that we are familiar with the features of the scientific research, let us delve into the very process of the scientific inquiry. Broadly, the research process could be divided into 3 phases. Phase 1, planning of the research study. Phase 2, its execution, and Phase 3, its reporting. Let us consider each of these phases with their step-by-step modality. Phase 1, planning of the research study. This phase would require a great deal of critical thinking on the part of the researcher, as the steps involved in this phase would determine the progress of the research study to the next 2 phases. The researcher would be required to follow these steps. Define the research problem, check for the relevance, that is context, literature review, formulate hypothesis, and design the experimental study. Let us consider each one of this in further details. Define the research problem. This could be considered the heart of the research study, as choosing the topic of the research would drive the whole process of a particular scientific inquiry. The researcher would usually consider his or her own interest areas as that would serve as a foundation knowledge. It is also important to factor in the time, resources availability, including the cost and the infrastructure available in terms of space, instrumentation, etc. Check for the relevance, that is the context. As mentioned earlier, that it would be best to consider the research problem which would be beneficial to the society. The rationale behind selecting the topic needs to be addressed. Literature review. In order to finalize the research problem, the researcher would need to read up on the relevant literature in order to know the background studies that have been done by the earlier researchers, as well as become abreast with the current trends of research in that field. The extensive literature survey helps in identifying the question that needs to be yet answered, which could be taken up by the researcher and plan the study accordingly. Formulate hypothesis. In order to address the research problem, the researcher would need to have certain assumptions which would be made, and then they will have to be either proved to be valid or invalid through actual execution of the research study and the data so collected. This therefore leads to the conceptualizing of the research problem in the light of the observations stated in the literature or the researcher has always been intrigued about. Hypothesis as one of the elements of research methodology will be further discussed in detail in the module M1.4. Designing the experimental study. The culmination of all the thinking, reading, and deliberating would lead to designing the experimental study, whereby the action plan of the research to be carried out will be drafted. The assumptions made will have to be verified by considering the factors called variables that may cause either no or some or drastic effects on the other related factors or processes involved in finding the solution to the research problem. It is important to consider these in order to carry out the experiment in a controlled manner. Let us now consider phase 2, execution of the research study. This phase would call upon the experimental skills of the researcher, whereby through the following stepwise process, a refined research outcome could be achieved. Set the methodology, check for the resources available, record data systematically, analyze the data for testing the hypothesis. Let us consider each one of these in detail. Setting the methodology. This is the actualization of the experimental design by selecting the correct research methods. The literature review done in the earlier phase could come in handy here, as the researcher would have gathered the references of the protocols to be followed for a given type of research area. Checking for the resources available. As the researcher would plan to go ahead with performing the experiments, it is imperative to ensure that all the required resources are kept ready. There could be demands of the certain experimental conditions to be maintained, and even this must be factored in. Availability of the model organisms is also very crucial for the start of the experimentation, as the case may be. Recording the data systematically. Researchers must have a very keen observation of the experimental results, and they should be recorded in the journal book as raw data. All the parameters tested, number of animals used, their daily observations, the readings obtained should be meticulously recorded. It would be a good idea to also start feeding the data in the computer so that further calculations can be easily processed using suitable software. Always maintain the backup of the data so collected. Analyzing the data for testing the hypothesis. The analysis of the data is mostly done by selecting the suitable statistical tools. It is important to identify the statistical test to be applied in order to analyze and draw conclusions that would be helpful for accepting or rejecting the hypothesis that was formulated in phase 1 and which is getting experimentally tested in phase 2. Researchers must decide upon the statistical tests to be used at the initial stage while setting the methodology so that the data collection is done as per that. In case there is inconsistency in the results or if the interpretations are inconclusive, the researchers would need to modify the methodology employed earlier and may need to tweak or change the variables accordingly. Let us move further to phase 3, reporting of the research study. This is the final phase which would lead to a successful completion of the planned research study. It is important to take stock of all the findings of the research carried out in phase 2 so that a correct interpretation is done and the relevant inferences are drawn out. This phase would include the following steps such as interpret the result, support the result with literature review, draw out conclusion, and finally report the research study. Let us deal with each of these in detail. Interpreting the result. This would be the outcome of the hypothesis, whether approved or disapproved as per the analysis done. Support the result with literature review. The interpretation must be supported by the background research which is done by the previous researchers. If the research study undertaken is novel, then parallels could be drawn from the studies done on the similar experimental designs and the parameters tested. Thirdly, drawing out the conclusions. Based on the interpretations and the testing of the hypothesis, the final conclusion could be established of the entire research study conducted. Further, it should also be made clear if this study could be extrapolated and what could be the further scope of this research undertaken. Lastly, reporting the research study. The output of the research study would be a document prepared stating the objectives, methods used, data obtained, results drawn out with their correct interpretations. This could be compiled as a thesis or could be published as a research article in Science Research Journal. It could also be presented as a paper or a poster at a research meet. This is an important aspect for disseminating the scientific knowledge that has been gained through a systematic research inquiry process. So to summarize, the research methodology is a set of organized activities such as planning, executing, and reporting of the research study to be pursued. Each of these broad activities has their steps that need to be followed meticulously. Thank you for watching.